All right, let me see if I can get the camera to pick me up. It's currently focused in on the floor. So let me see if I can get it. Follow me. Maybe. It's apparently going to stay in downward position. Let's hope I don't. I didn't mean to just yank that out from under you. Maybe, okay, let's see if it's gonna go there. No, we're still focused on my feet. One second. Oh, no, it's gone up now.
You can turn off the tracking. I think the tracking setup is weird.
Oh, so you can.
Yeah, you can. I don't know why the default was set there though. You can turn that off so it's not yellow. And then you can mute this thing.
Okay.
You want it like up here?
Yeah, right there on the,
Right there?
yep, that's great. And just hit, what do you hit to keep it?
Oh, it'll stay like that now.
It'll stay like that?
Yeah, I'll reset the home position. I think the home position is messed up. It'll stay like this until you hit auto tracking.
Okay,
And then if you want to adjust it, just use these left controls.
okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I didn't realize I could do that.
Yeah, no problem.
So. There. Okay. So today we need to talk about new products. And it's enormously important that companies continually develop, particularly large companies. A lot of what I've tried to do in this class is make it relevant to you and to your skill sets that you're going to develop as you go through your college career and become marketable yourself, right? And so one of the things that I think that you'll have to do, if we think about this in terms of yourself, is there's going to be a need in the future to continuously learn new skills in order to be competitive in the work environment, just like companies have to continually develop new products and services in order to stay relevant. If we think about one of the all-American brands, the first product that we sent to communist China, I think I told you this, was Coca-Cola. In fact, during the Carter administration, there was something called the Coca-Cola Connection. 4 of his cabinet secretaries had worked at Coca-Cola. For example, his Attorney General Bell had been the chief general counsel at one point in time for Coca-Cola, and many of his other cabinet secretaries had sat on the boards of Coca-Cola. And so it was called the Coca-Cola Connection. So this is like a product that's been around for a long time. But as we have become more health conscious in the United States, and we've become more concerned about what we're consuming, I think the product life cycle of Coca-Cola itself in the US is on the decline. And so Coca-Cola is constantly coming up with new products. If we look at, for example, Coca-Cola's brand portfolio, what we see is that there is a huge amount of not just Coke anymore, right? There's the traditional Coke, or, the original Coca-Cola. There's all of these other Gold Peak iced tea, Simply, Topo Chico, vitamin water, things like that, that Coca-Cola is looking at and investing in and constantly coming up with new products that they are developing. And why is that? Well, because preferences change over time. If we went back in time again to the 1950s, Coke was a big deal and lots of people drank Coke. If you were going to have a soft drink, it was Coke or Pepsi. Now there are all of these different competitors that enter the market. If you go out on 2nd Street to Arcadia, there's a gas station and restaurant and convenience store called Pops, and they have all different kinds of new and interesting and locally sourced and small label soft drink products in Pops, right? So they have to continually develop new products in order to stay competitive. You will have to continually develop your skills in order to stay competitive in the market going forward. So some scholars estimate that companies need to be working on 25 or more new products at a time. If we think about things like a drug company, right? There are new diseases that have come up. We experienced this during the COVID pandemic, and they had to respond to those challenges by developing drugs, tangible goods that would meet that particular pandemic, right? So vaccines and then therapeutics for people who had actually got them. New companies that fail to develop new products will probably not remain relevant in the market for very long, and they will eventually go under. Also, we have to continually develop new products because most products, just like most businesses, will probably fail. 95% of new businesses fail within the first 5 years. And so new products often fail. Even large companies that follow the sort of protocol of the way you bring new products to market will experience failures. In my lifetime, one of the big things was the launch of New Coke. They decided that based on partly as a result of something called the Pepsi Challenge, Coke needed to modify their brand product offering in their classic product of a soft drink. And so they launched New Coke. And I think they did everything right, and it was still a miserable failure. People responded very negatively to it because they had nostalgia for the original Coke, which they had to bring back. So we need to classify, if we're going to talk about how we're going to develop new products, we first of all have to think about the classification of the product that we are developing. What is it that we are doing? There are 2 big broad categories. Is it a good, something that is tangible, that you can experience with your 5 senses? You can see it, taste it, hear it, feel it, right? Is Is it a tangible product or is it an intangible product? Now, in the United States, the biggest portion of our economy is shifting towards intangibles. So what are those? Those are things that you can't necessarily experience with the five senses. They are intellectual property, benefits, services. Scholars will argue, and we'll talk about this in more depth, that all products are really services. We don't really want the product for itself. We want the product for what it does for us. So benefits. And the big part, again, in this country, in terms of our economy, is shifting towards a post-industrial economy in which services make up 75%. So what is it that we're going to need in terms of services? Well, what kinds of experiences are we going to want to have? In terms of entertainment, for example, that's changed radically over the last 5 years, even. When I was a kid growing up, going to the movies was a big deal. We went to the movies. And now movie theaters are having to offer a ever increasing wide variety. You know, it was forever and ever from the 1950s when my mother was going to the movies, the 1950s and 60s, to when I was a kid going to the movies. You went to the movies, you bought popcorn and a Coke, and you sat there and you watched the movie on a big screen. That's no longer enough. The experience is now a multifaceted deal. You sat in a theater style seat and you watched the movie on the big screen. People now want the reclining chairs. Why would you go to the movies if you've got a better setup at home than you can get in the movies? Is there anything that we still want to see on the big screen? There are, I think, some movies that people still want to see. So what is it that attracts people to go to the movies? Well, it's now the ability to have service brought to you. When I was a kid growing up, if you wanted popcorn or nachos or candy, you went to the concession stand. Now the movie theaters are bringing that to you. It's like tableside service in these venues, right? So they're having to adapt to changing needs because people can have these experiences at home by having a really high def, big screen television that will mimic the experience that they could get on the big screen in their own home. So what is it that is going to make them competitive? Ideas are also a form of services, and those are enormously important in our political and social and capitalistic landscape. Things like political marketing during campaign years become enormously important. So that's the marketing of ideas. We can also classify products within these two large, broad categories of goods, tangible items, and services. We can classify goods as either consumer products or business and industrial products. So in consumer products, we have a number of categories of products, and the way you bring these products to market and the way you develop them largely depends on the subclass of product that you're dealing with. Is it a convenience product? What's a convenience product? It's something that you don't think a lot about. You just buy as you need them. If you think about convenience stores, things like food, snacks, things like that you buy at a convenience. Or is it a shopping product? Is it something that you actually think about more? Again, if we think about the rational actor theory, we talked about the more risk there is involved in the purchase of the product, the more you're probably going to do an information search for that product. So shopping products or those kinds of products are things like furniture, large things like washers, dryers, vacuum cleaners, things like that. Is it a specialty product? That's generally customized goods that you may need. So for example, I'm a commercial pilot. One of the products that we use is radio and navigation aids. Those are highly specialized towards the type of flying that you're doing. And when you purchase those products, those are generally specialty products. You take an airplane, and if you want to add something to it, you can't just strap it onto the airplane. You have to go through a A&P mechanic, and it has to be documented and installed in the aircraft in a way that is safe and follows FAA guidelines. And so those are highly customized products that you get when you fly an airplane. And then there are unsought products. What are unsought products? Those are things that we generally don't think about until we need them. Things like roadside assistance. Does anybody, for example, say, I've got my favorite wrecker service? Well, if you have your favorite wrecker service, you probably have a vehicle that's not terribly reliable if you're using the same thing over and over and over again. And I suggest that most people would go get a new car at that point, right? If they have their wrecker service on speed dial. How do you find these products? Well, a lot of times with unsought products like wrecker services, you will use an aggregator like AAA. You'll call AAA and say, I'm broken down on I-35, my car won't start, and they will send out the service that's closest to you in terms of their membership that agree to providing service based on the AAA rate schedule, right? So funeral services are another one that are generally unsought. We don't think about them until we need them. Business products. So these are products that are purchased by industries or businesses in order to complete their mission, to service their customers or constituents. And when we talk about business products, again, when we talk about the business to business environment, we're also talking about governmental entities and nonprofits as well, things like the Red Cross. So we can classify business products in a number of ways. And when we talk about the development of those business products, again, the way we bring those to market is going to depend on what type of product it is. Is it a component? Is it going to become part of the final product? So for example, paint for a car. We used to have a General Motors manufacturing facility in Oklahoma City, and they employed a lot of people and they manufactured cars. And one of the things that you have when you manufacture cars is you have the need for paint. And I remember in the late 1990s, they developed a paint, for example, that would change color depending on the angle at which you were looking at it. Does anybody remember? You all are probably too young to remember. Anybody remember the cars that would change color? It was one of the product innovations. It didn't last very long. That was one of the sort of fad things that happened, and you don't see anybody really, driving those products anymore. And in fact, one of the things that I think we've seen that's been interesting is if you look at the number of colors of new cars, again, if you went back to the 1990s, there were lots of different colors and lots of really wild colors that were coming out. And now if you look on the road, there's like 5 or 6 primary colors that you'll see. And the biggest two are probably white and black. I mean, there's just an abundance of white pickup trucks on the road. Why is it that lots of people have white pickup trucks, particularly in Oklahoma?
They're service vehicles.
They're service, and they show dirt less than for example, like you wouldn't think that black would show dirt, but it shows the red dirt in Oklahoma with the dust storms pretty easily. Is it a support product? Is it used in the production of other goods and services? So my niece married into a family that manufactures conveyor belts. That's a support product. The conveyor belts are used to move product down an assembly line, and they manufacture conveyor belts. One of their customers is Boeing. So they manufacture conveyor belts and parts of conveyor belts and services and repair stuff for those kinds of support products. Is it an installation? Things like buildings and fixtures, equipment that are part of the actual sort of real property of a business. So when you lease a business, when you lease space, you generally build out in commercial real estate that space. And it's highly customizable. Again, if you think about restaurants, there are requirements that are mandated by the health code and the safety codes in almost every location. And so if you want to start a new restaurant, you have equipment and it has to fit the space. And so things like hoods, for example, for ovens and stoves are mandatory. Those are largely, in many respects, custom built because they have to be designed to the space specs of the kitchen that is being built out for the restaurant. Is it an accessory equipment, things like tools or office equipment, printers, computers that is being used in the business? Or is it supplies that the business uses, things like copy paper, pens, ink cartridges, cables, things like that they may need? Or is it industrial services, repair, maintenance, legal services, accounting, auditing? And we're seeing lots of businesses pop up to meet these needs. One of the things that's become, for example, more and more prevalent is because of the regulatory environment that almost every business faces with regard to things like Department of Labor regulations, time and hour wage requirements, posting of compensation information. A lot of companies don't have enough people to justify having, for example, their own human resources department. And so they are now outsourcing that. And so you've seen businesses pop up in the last 10 years, something that you wouldn't have seen before were independent businesses that provided human resources capabilities. And one of those, for example, in the Oklahoma City area is a company called YHR. So if you have a company that doesn't have really enough employees to justify having a director of human resources or personnel, as it used to be called, you can contract with this firm to provide that. And they do things like they will develop employee manuals for you and make sure that your HR compliance posters are up to date, that you're using a payroll processing service that is capable of figuring out, the taxes and things like that and the withholdings that you have to have. So those are enormously important. And those kinds of services are increasing in the post-industrial economy. Once we decide what kind of service or product we're talking about, then we can talk about whether or not we're talking about the specific product item. So these are oftentimes with regard to consumer packaged goods called SKUs. And for example, the average Walmart Supercenter carries over 100,000 SKUs. That's an individual item, 100,000 individual items in the average Walmart. One of the things that we've seen is that there are companies that are coming along and are filling niches because the amount and variety of choice in something like a Walmart Supercenter can be overwhelming. And so I was listening to a podcast as I was coming back from spring break. I hope you all had a good spring break. Anybody get to travel on spring break? Go somewhere? Where'd you go?
I went to Colorado and Kansas City.
Wow, that's a big area to travel.
Yeah, families, boyfriend's families in Kansas City. Then we hit Salina in Kansas, and then from Salina we went to Colorado.
Colorado. Okay. I went to Colorado as well for spring break. I went to Pagosa Springs with my family because they wanted to go skiing at Wolf Creek. I don't know why. We have a house in Santa Fe. I don't know why we couldn't have gone there, but my brother wanted to go to Wolf Creek, so we went to Wolf Creek. And as I was driving across, the plains of Texas, the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico through Santa Fe and up to Pagosa Springs, I was listening to a podcast from the Freakonomics series, and they were talking about should Trader Joe's run the United States. So Trader Joe's, how many of you have been to a Trader Joe's? There's one here in Oklahoma City. They're pretty entertaining. They're a grocery store, and they're a grocery store that operates like no other grocery store. They don't advertise. So Walmart advertises, Target advertises on television, things like that. They don't advertise. They don't have circulars. They carry, so the average grocery store carries 35,000 SKUs. The average Walmart over 100,000 SKUs. The average Target Supercenter over 100,000 SKUs. What does the average Trader Joe carry? Anybody want to guess? 3,000 SKUs. So that's an enormous number of products to think about, right? 3,000 to think about 3,000. But when you think about it in comparison to a, you know, Albertsons or a Homeland or a Walmart or Target, that's a really narrowed sort of set. And what makes them successful? Well, they carry unique products and services, and they sell them at a really cheap cost. How do they do that? Well, and it's more of an experience. Going into a Trader Joe's is more of an experience than it is to go into a Walmart. They are obsessive about customer service. And how do they sell so cheaply? How do they compete with Walmart on things like prices? Well, rather than having a huge selection of SKUs in one particular product line, so a grouping of closely related products, they'll have one or two. So if you go into a Walmart and you think about all of the different types of, for example, macaroni and cheese that they have the Great Value, they have Shells and Cheese, they have Kraft, they have, you know, all of these, what's the one that my niece likes? Ann's or something like that. Mac and cheese, organic mac and cheese. I like, is mac and cheese healthy? I'm gonna try to make it healthy with organic, right? So they've got all these different ones. Well, what will a Trader Joe's have? They'll have one kind of mac and cheese, right? Instead of having, and that allows them to buy huge quantities of it, and get the discount, take advantage of the discount without having such a wide variety. So in the product lines, these closely related grouping of products, they have far fewer specific stock keeping units in those lines. And the product mix are all of the lines that are offered by an organization. So Walmart, for example, if we think about the product mix, they've got textiles, they've got laundry, detergent, personal hygiene products, pharmacy, and health and beauty, grocery, which includes fresh, frozen, meat, you know, all of those things go into the product mix, for example, that a Walmart carries. So when we talk about newness, what makes a product new? There are various ways that we can think about the newness of a product. And I will look and see, I don't remember which version of the iPhone I have, so I'm gonna look. So this is an iPhone 14 Pro Max. What is the latest version of the iPhone? What version are they on? 16. So I'm 2 generations behind already. And I think I got this phone like maybe 2.5 years ago, and we're on the 16. So probably, I think when I got it, maybe they just released the 15. I can't remember. I think that was right. So is there much difference between, I don't know, I haven't looked at the 16. I haven't gone in to look for a new phone for a while. Is there much difference between the 16 and the 14 Pro Max? Probably not. Not really. I'm gonna guess that the camera may be a little better. It may have, I don't know, slightly better what?
Better battery.
Better battery, maybe. The battery's pretty good on this. I remember the first cell phone I had back in the 90s. I think I've told you all this. The only thing it did was it was an actual phone. These are actually sort of inappropriately named devices now because nobody actually talks on the phone anymore. What do you use these primarily for? If you're in terms of communicating with your friends, probably texting, right? How many of you actually talk to your friends on the phone? One person, few of you. Like most people would rather text than talk. And so this device is not really used as a phone so much as it is sort of a personal communication and organization device. I keep all of my, for example, schedule on it. That's something that the first cell phones did not have the capability of doing. When they came out with the first iPhone, it was a radical departure even from the platforms that were available. The biggest platform at the time and ones that most businesses used was something called the BlackBerry. And they were actually pretty useful from a business standpoint because they had a keyboard. And if you can text or if you can type by touch, you could text by touch, right? Because if you know the QWERTY key code or the QWERTY keyboard, you could be pretty quick with the BlackBerry. You can't really do that with an iPhone because it doesn't have the ability to tell where you are on the keyboard by feel because the keyboard is a screen, right? It's a virtual keyboard, which makes it difficult to type with. But it was a radical departure from what had gone before in terms of having this huge amount of screen space so that you could really enjoy looking at the visual of the display, but it lacked that, touch keyboard, right? And that was radical. Now, the difference between the iPhone 14 and the iPhone 16 is probably going to be negligible. So is it a revolutionary newness like the iPhone was when it was launched, or is it a modification of a existing technology that's already known? The first sort of smartphone was introduced in 1994, and it was called the Simon Personal Communicator. And if you look at pictures of that, it's a huge sort of clunky device versus, the first iPhone, which was this sort of sleek, modern, interesting device that required quite a bit of learning or new learning on the part of the consumer, which is one of the things that we talk about. From the consumer's perspective, does it require a huge amount of learning? Well, when the iPhone was released, it required that you learn quite a bit about stuff. At this point in time, it's not really going to require that much. Even when they update the software on it, is it require that much difference in learning how to use the apps, how to download an app and use those? Probably not. So that's continuous innovation, changes and features that don't really require a whole lot of new adaptation on the part of the consumer. Is it dynamically continuous innovation? So minor changes that require, a lot of times if there are updates, you do have some minor changes that you have to account for. Forever and ever and ever, when Microsoft released its word processing program, which was Microsoft Word, to compete with a product called WordPerfect. And in many respects, WordPerfect was a better product, particularly if you can type by touch, because what WordPerfect allowed you to do was it allowed you to use controls and commands rather than having to use a mouse. And if you think about it, if you have to use a mouse to do things like, for example, when you're writing papers in academics, from my own perspective, you have to cite sources, right? And how do you cite sources? Well, now it's largely parenthetical. When I started as a college student, we actually had to footnote or endnote, and that was kind of a giant pain in the neck if you were using a typewriter, because you had to figure out if you were using footnotes, how much space on a page you would have to leave for the footnotes at the bottom of the page, and then you would actually have to type it. So you'd put a line at the bottom of the page, and then you would list your footnotes at the bottom of the page. And WordPerfect came out and it would do it automatically for you. So you could just say, insert a footnote, and if you knew the keystrokes, you could do it without using the mouse, and it would insert the footnote. And now we use parenthetical citation for most types of, unless you're a lawyer, we still use footnotes in legal briefing for some reason. The courts just cling to an ancient form of citation called the Blue Book, which is still used, like I said, when I file court briefs, but it's not used any other time. Microsoft Word and WordPerfect would do that for you, but Microsoft Word, as opposed to WordPerfect, you had to actually pick up the mouse, and you have to go in and you have to go up to the top of the screen and click insert and then put footnote, right? And it will put it in there. So one of the things that happened, and I remember this forever and ever and ever, the reason I tell you this story is that forever and ever and ever, the default on Microsoft Word and the default on WordPerfect was 12-point Times New Roman font. And in the early days of word processing, there were very few font selections. There was like Times New Roman, and there was Calibre or something like that. What's the default setting now when you go into Microsoft or when you go into Word? It's not Times New Roman, and I can't figure out why. Is it Arial? I can't figure out why they've defaulted to Arial. I thought it may have been, let me open up one. Comes up with. I thought it was Calibre is the one that they switch the screen here. Oh, this one is defaulted to Aptos. I don't even know what that is. But there's literally hundreds of different ones that you can do now. And the default is no longer necessarily Times New Roman. So that's one of those things that's a minor change. You have to go in, and if you want, and lots of, for example, journal articles, when you're writing journals, will specify that you have to use Times New Roman as the font, right? So you have to go in and actually change it. So that's a minor change that required some behavioral modification. Discontinuous innovation requires high levels of learning on the part of the consumer. So from the consumer's perspective, the discontinuous innovation is something that is really radically new. I remember 25 years ago when I was first on city council in Guthrie, that was the very dawn of having all of these sorts of cameras and things like that. And when I was on city council when I was in my 20s, that was the very beginnings of them experimenting with the use of body cameras. And this was a radical change in the way that the police went about policing. Why? If you put a body camera on somebody, all of a sudden, what do you have that makes policing different than it was before? Historically, what?
I mean, if anybody gets a camera on their body, they're a whole different person. So I mean, they act appropriately.
People act differently, or at least they used to. I don't know so much about your generation because your generation is so used to being videoed and photographed that you really don't think about it. But for my generation, you think differently. People act differently, or they did. I don't know that you all do anymore because you're so used to having absolutely really no privacy whatsoever. But people act differently in front of a camera historically than they did before. This really started with one event, and it was the first time that the police were really caught on camera, it was the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles. And somebody had, and that, at that point in time, video cameras were these large things that you had to put this large cassette into, and then it would record, maybe, depending on the setting that you put it on, for about 90 minutes at the most, right? And now you can record like hundreds of hours of stuff by streaming it, like I'm doing in this classroom, by streaming the content, right? We have the ability to absolutely radically change the way we deliver content in the postmodern world. So the first police camera, body cameras that they had were, you know, the police had to sort of figure out, well, first of all, because at the time they only stored so much information, you had to turn it on, right? So they actually had to, they didn't leave them on because data storage was precious. And so they would only turn them on. You had to physically turn the device on when they would make a stop. Okay? And it radically changed the perspective of, for example, even attorneys and lawyers, the way they presented evidence in court, because now you no longer just have the eyewitness testimony of what the officer, his subjective interpretation of the situation is. You have the objective reality of seeing what's actually going on, right? And so they put dash cams in the cars, and this radically changed the way things are. And so it required a lot of learning on the part of police and lawyers, district attorneys, in dealing with and prosecuting crimes. I remember in the early ages of the dash cam, for example, there were several cases that came out. So they set a legal limit for what is considered intoxicated, and that's a presumption. The presumption can be rebutted, right? So if you blow 0.08, the presumption is that you are driving while intoxicated, right? That's DUI, driving under the influence. And that's a presumption. But they had these dash cam videos, and lawyers were showing, they, like the defense attorneys were actually subpoenaing these dash cam videos because their client would pass a field sobriety test, but fail the breathalyzer. And so you had juries that were looking at this and saying, I don't think the guy's drunk because he could pass the field sobriety test, right? So it radically changed the way we engaged in policing. But it required a huge amount of learning on the part of police officers and the legal community itself. We can also talk about newness from a legal perspective. The FTC says that newness is defined as up to 6 months from regular distribution. Now, the question is, what is regular distribution? You would think that that would be easy to define, but it's not necessarily. If you have, for example, test markets, does that count? And you release it widely in a test market, does that count as regular distribution? That's a question that's not easily answered, and it is largely context dependent. So what is new? The FTC says up to 6 months from regular distribution is considered new. We can also think about newness from the organizational perspective, the company that's developing the product or service. How much is there in terms of risk? Is it an extension of something? And that's fairly low risk. The risk is cannibalization. Now, there are companies, Apple is one of them, obviously. Why is it that they're releasing the iPhone 16? Is it radically different? Does anybody have a 16? You have a 16?
Yeah.
Is it, and what did you have before you had the 16?
13 Pro Max.
You had the 13 Pro Max, so you went from 13 to 16. So quite a few like iterations in there. Did you have to like completely learn new skills?
It's pretty
Right.
much the same, just there's a camera button now. Like you just press this button and it switches to
And it switches to camera? Okay, all
That's like
right.
the only difference.
Is that like all that useful?
Not really, I don't use it at all.
I mean, they, at one point in time, in one of the smartphones, I don't think it was the iPhone, but it may have been one of the Droids, they had a button on there for Facebook so that you could instantly like just hit it and log on to your Facebook. And I don't know, was that all that? It obviously didn't last because I don't see anybody with these phones that still have a Facebook button on them. Why don't you have that? Well, you've got an icon on your screen. How much different is it, to just like hit the button? So that one has a camera button that's different from the 13. Mine doesn't have the camera button. Was it really that much different? Why does Apple do this? Why do they do this? This is just an extension of what they've already got. Why do they do it?
Someone probably gives.
They deliberately cannibalize, right? I mean, a lot of companies have to think about, are you cannibalizing the product that you already have? Do you have like a winning product and you're going to cannibalize the product? You're not actually bringing more people. You might launch a new product in the hopes of bringing new customers to your business, right? Or are you simply cannibalizing the customers that you already have? Apple deliberately does this. Why? Well, because once they've sold me this phone, right, they've made the money that I'm going to give them, unless they can convince me that in 2 years, I need a new phone. And because the cost of switching to a new phone is relatively low. Now, car companies in the United States did this. They would make radical changes. One of the things that was interesting during the 1980s was American car companies, in terms of design, radically innovated on model year over model year. There were big changes in many instances from one model year to the next among the American car companies. The idea was that it would encourage people to buy, but cars, unlike this phone, now, like the Apple phones are not cheap, right? I mean, compared to what you can get a Droid phone for or something like that, they're not cheap. But it's, over the course of 2 or 3 years, is the cost all that much? No, but over the course of 2 or 3 years, buying the average car is now something like $75,000 for the average new car. That's not something that people trade out every 2 or 3 years. And if you looked at the European cars of the time, the Mercedes-Benz, the Volvo, things like that, they didn't change designs. In fact, that became one of the selling points, and that's why a lot of people actually started buying European cars, was because it looked the same. You couldn't tell the difference between a 1980 and a 1989 Mercedes-Benz. They were kind of a boxy car with this, 3-pointed star emblem on the front. And that became a selling point, was the fact that they weren't cannibalizing the market by coming up with radically new designs. One of the problems that you have, for example, with car manufacturing, particularly when you do that, when you come up with all these new designs, is that you have a lot of maybe design defects that you didn't think about, that you have to work out. And that can be problematic. And American car companies kind of got a bad reputation for not necessarily, because they were such innovators in design, having the highest quality. And things like the Japanese and the Europeans were seen as having higher quality. So are you cannibalizing? Is it just an extension, which is low risk? Or is it a significant innovation? Again, when Apple came up with the, the iPod, that was radically different. There were digital music storage devices on the market, but Apple really came up with some different designs and really made that much better. Now, what's happened with that is I remember when everybody wanted an iPod, and they were, the big thing at the gym, everybody was, had their iPod, the iPod Shuffle, because it was little and you could, like clip it onto your t-shirt fairly easily. It wasn't like if you had one of the larger, older digital devices, they were fairly heavy. They were like basically like a Walkman was. And so, Apple comes out with this little tiny cube device that would play lots of music, or store lots of music, and it was fairly easy to keep. That's largely been cannibalized by this device, right? Because we all have this and we keep it, and it does so much more than just play music that has been, the iPhone has cannibalized that device. But it was a radical innovation at the time, the digitized music. What was it before we had digitized music? Well, you had a CD player, a portable CD player. Those in the early ages were horrible compared to tapes because they were a more stable platform if you were moving around. Then they figured out how to make them so that they were stable even though you were moving around, and people went to the CD, and then of course to digitized music. One of the things that's interesting, and it's happening among your generation, is that there is an interest in retro. And so there's been a new market that's emerged in terms of sort of retro types of ways of listening to music. How many of you have gone out and bought a turntable? A couple of you. They're cool. Vinyl is sort of made a comeback, and people are putting together. It's now become very popular. There's a whole shop, like when I was in Santa Fe, when we passed through to see my father, there's a whole shop, an audio shop that specializes in restoring and selling vintage audio equipment that even has things like the old transistors that and people are putting together these things. But that's that's an example of how sometimes we actually regress. So is it a significant innovation? Is it a brand extension? So for example, Google is a technology company, and this is an example of not engaging in marketing myopia. So one of the seminal early papers in marketing that was published in the Journal of Marketing, JM, was called Marketing Myopia. And in that article, Theodore Levitt argues that, if you go back again to the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of the largest companies in the United States were railroad companies. Why? Because it was necessary to transport goods, and the railroad companies were very efficient at doing that. But if you come to the beginning of the 20th century, or the middle of the 20th century, that was not necessarily the case. The railroad companies were not the largest. Why? Because they became myopic. They lost track of the larger picture of what they were, and they were really good railroad companies, and things had moved on. People wanted goods and services brought to them even faster than the railroads could do that. And so how is that? Well, it's transporting goods and services by freight over interstate or by air, right? So Google launched, for example, the Pixel phone. Google is a technology company. They didn't lose track of the fact. They could have said, what we are is an information provider. Like, what is Google? What is the biggest thing that Google does? Well, they are a search engine, right? And how do they make money? Well, they sell ads, right, to people who want to optimize their place in the information search when you Google something, right? So Google then comes out with a phone. That's a technology. It's a product that uses the World Wide Web. in many respects to provide just a different sort of mode of delivery of what Google was providing, which is information services, right? So that's a brand extension. And how much risk is there in that? I was really surprised. One of the things that oftentimes happens with brand extensions is you are really good at one thing and you branch out into something else. This happened to Hewlett Packard under Carly Fiorina, and you didn't necessarily know the market or understand how to do it. One of the things that I was really surprised at was when Amazon decided they were going to become a logistics company. I thought, wow, that's a huge risk. Why? Because there were already two major players in the field and one government provider in the field of logistics. What was that? That was UPS, FedEx, and the United States Postal Service. And I thought, why not just use that? But Amazon decided they were going to have their own logistics services. And I thought that's a huge, huge risk, right? When you could just partner with UPS or FedEx, but Amazon did it. And they actually have been really successful in terms of that brand extension, going from providing goods and services over the internet to actually delivering. And that's it's been a remarkable transformation in my opinion. New product success or failure. Why is it that some products will fail and others will succeed? And again, the example I give here is one I talked about earlier in class is New Coke. New Coke was launched because they were responding to what they thought was the market demand for a different taste in their soft drink product, and people just absolutely hated it, and they failed. So why is it that they failed? Well, there are a number of reasons that businesses and products fail. Businesses oftentimes fail because people, particularly in small businesses, will project their own desire onto the market and not understand the market. The fact that you love something and want to do it doesn't mean that there's a huge market for that desire. I would venture to guess, I think I've told you all this before, I fly competitive aerobatics. I'm going to guess that probably most of you in this room have absolutely no desire to do that. In fact, if I took you up and put you through spins and aileron rolls, some of you might throw up. It causes equilibrium problems for a lot of people in their ears. So if I projected my desire to do that and decided I was going to build airplanes and sell them because everybody's going to want to do aerobatics, what's the population of people that do aerobatics in the world competitively? It's about 1,000 people in the entire world, right, that do this competitively. So projecting your own desires onto the market can be dangerous without understanding how large the market is for that. Now, there are ways of making money even in very small markets like that, right? But you have to be a specialty producer of goods, and lots of those goods are specially produced. They are experimental aircraft. The largest category of aerobatic aircrafts are experimental because not a lot of people want to do them. So we have to start with a well-defined target market. The protocol to have a greater chance of success is start by defining your target market, having a well-defined target market, and specifying customer needs, wants, and preferences. And then finally, how does your product satisfy number two? Now you can do this and still you could decide when you get to number three that you can't efficiently do this. You can't satisfy those needs and wants. Why is it that in many respects, the markets for lots of goods and services is really, the number of producers is really small? If we think about, for example, learning management systems, when we went out to buy a new learning management system, we had forever a product called Blackboard, I think is what we had when we first started. and Blackboard was bought out by another company. And the FTC actually regulates this, but in many respects, the market is so unique that there are just not going to be a lot of producers. So we started out with this learning management system when it became obvious, and I remember when this happened, and one of the reasons I got my first teaching job was because they said, I didn't have the doctoral degree at that point in time. I just had a master's degree. And generally speaking, if you want to teach at the collegiate level, you have to have a doctoral degree. And they were willing to take me because I was 22 years old. And they said, can you teach online? I said, sure, I can do that. I had no idea what I was doing. But I thought, I'm young. I can figure this out. Like, right, I've got all summer to kind of figure this out. And I did. And it was the dawn. I mean, I started teaching online at the dawn of online learning. Before that, we still had, when I started teaching, there was a bigger department on campus called correspondence, where they basically mailed you everything. If you wanted to take a course that wasn't on campus, you went through correspondence and you basically got the textbook and the materials, and then you would arrange to either come to campus and take your tests at the testing center, or you'd go to a library where you'd agree to have a librarian proctor. They would mail the exam to the library, and the librarian would, if you were in this small town in Western Oklahoma, for example, administer the exam, right? So online learning. So there's lots of colleges and universities. There's thousands of colleges and universities, but how many learning management systems are there in the market? Well, there are really only 2 or 3 providers of learning management. Now, this is a huge expense. We spend an enormous amount of money, and then you spend a lot of money maintaining the service that we bought. So why aren't there more people in the market? Well, there may be a huge market, and the market for learning management system is not just for people at colleges and universities. It's also primary and secondary education, which is the company that I worked for, developed that. And again, there were about 5 companies that did this, that developed learning management systems for the K-12 market. Well, you'd think, well, there's 64,000 school districts in the United States, right? And I told you that one of the things is if you can become a government supplier of stuff, that's a fairly risk-free business. Why? Because governments, unlike businesses, have to pay their bills. They have to pay their bills, right? States cannot go bankrupt. There is no bankruptcy. Businesses can go bankrupt, and when they do, their creditors lose their money in bankruptcy. When a business goes bankrupt, what do you do? Well, states can't do that, right? They can't. So if you can sell to the state, you can make a lot of money. Why are there only 5 producers at the time that I was in the industry of learning management systems for K-12? Well, there may be a huge target market, 64,000 school districts in the United States, right? And there may be a huge demand. One of the things that happened when I was in that industry was George Walker Bush was president of the United States, and he convinced Congress to pass something called No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind engaged in high stakes testing. You all have done this. You all probably remember it. You had to take these tests in primary and secondary education, these high stakes tests, right? That were supposed to measure whether or not you were at grade level. You all remember these tests, right? And particularly one of the areas that most school districts struggle with to get students up to grade level is math, because math is hard, right? And so if you have these high stakes tests and there are consequences for not meeting those high stakes tests, which was you lost federal funding if you were a school district, which didn't make a lot of sense because you're going to cut funding and you're going to do what to the school district? You're going to basically damage, but that's what happened, right? So school districts were desperate to get students up to grade level in these core areas, the Common Core of education. Now, why is it that there weren't more than 5 producers? Well, because although there was a well-defined target, there were lots of needs and wants because every school-age child now had to meet these standards in order to graduate, right? There was no more what they called social promotion. Well, why is it? Well, it's really expensive to develop a learning management system that has content along with it requires an enormous amount of investment. At the K-12 level, at the collegiate level, I put all of the content into the learning management system for my courses. We don't let teachers at the K-12 level do that. So who are you having to hire? You have to hire content creators. And in order to be a content creator, it's not like, I mean, you all probably are content creators. You probably have, I don't know, Instagram and Facebook, and you're going live and you're sending your friends stuff and you're posting videos. How many of you have done TikTok, right? Like you're putting your videos on TikTok. So you're a content creator. It's not just like that. We can't just throw stuff out there if we're trying to educate children from age 5 through 18, right? So these people are highly educated. Most of them have doctoral degrees, and they're writing this content. That's expensive. So even though there's a demand and even though there's a well-known market, there are lots of providers out there that don't want to take the investment that it takes to break into that market, right? So how is our product going to satisfy the needs, wants, and preferences of the market that we've identified? And that could be very difficult and be very costly. Even if there's a market, if you can't differentiate your product, you're probably going to fail. And one of the biggest reasons that products fail is that there is a lack of differentiation between the product and even though that there may be a great deal of demand. Again, why are there only a handful of providers of this device? I mean, this is a huge market. Everyone now needs, with very few exceptions, everybody needs this device. Most of you don't have a landline anymore. And in fact, until recently, the only reason that some people had landlines was because maybe they had a home security system that required a landline. No longer have to have the landline for the home security system. You can get them to operate off of a cellular network now. So if you have Wi-Fi, you can have home security and not have to have the landline. Forever and ever and ever, you still had to have a landline. That's gone. No longer need that, right? So most of you don't have a landline. Everybody has one of these devices, but to bring something like this to market requires an enormous amount of investment in technology and specification that lots of companies just don't have. So that's the first thing, is to have a well-defined target market, specify customer needs, and then how is your product going to satisfy number 2? So why is it that they fail? No significant point of difference. To this point, Apple has been able to convince us that we need to buy the latest and greatest phone. Now, I think that for most of us, the only reason that we probably go out and buy, the only reason that I'm going to get the 16 is because this one basically becomes so old, the battery stops holding a charge, and the price point between changing the battery and getting the newest model just makes it, the inconvenience makes it worth it for me to go down to whatever it is, whichever provider it is I have, and get the new phone. But at some point, as batteries have gotten better and better and better, the time between trade-in on things like this may decrease. So there is an insignificant point of difference. And I think that we've seen that happening. When Apple started releasing the first iPhones, people really they were excited about the differences between the first iPhone and the second generation and third generation. They were radically different. The first generations, there was first of all, they put a camera on a phone. And this is one of the things where I have to admit that I was unable to see how popular this would be. So people put like cameras on phones, and I thought that is the dumbest thing. Who would want that? Like the quality was really poor on those first phones. I mean, it was awful. The picture, it was like a blob. But people like, I can take a picture with my phone. I can send it to my friends. And I'm like, you can't see that, right? Now, the quality that you can get on the cameras on your phone is absolute. I mean, you can do almost what professional photographers are capable of doing with your phone. By, the camera quality is really good. The zoom quality is incredible. I mean, it's gotten much better, right? So there really were radical differences between that first iPhone and this phone. Like it's a radical difference. But is there, now I've got 3 cameras. You've got the 16. How many cameras does it have on the? Has it got 3? I mean, some of them have. I've
Each
seen.
of them are, like, all 3 are being used at the same time. It depends on if you're doing, like, you could have a cinematic mode where
Right.
you do it in move, it's, like you said, moving quality, it's
Right.
really quality regular that's taking a regular picture.
I mean, people on YouTube now. I was watching this one kid that I follow on YouTube that's a content creator, and they were asking, people were asking what kinds of setup do you have for your studio to record? And he's like, I do all of this off of my iPhone. That's how good the quality is in terms of being able to record. If you go back and look, when I first started recording classes and putting them on YouTube, they didn't have live streaming on YouTube. And so I had to actually record it. And it took a long time. I mean, it was a lot of work for me to record. I would have to record this on a camcorder. I had a tripod, and then I would upload it. And it took forever for those videos to upload to YouTube. Now I go live. I've got a camera in the room. The sound quality, if you go back and look at those early videos that I have, you can find them on YouTube. The sound quality was horrible. I was teaching largely in the Troy Smith Auditorium because I taught the big principles of marketing classes in there. And, it was echoey and you couldn't hear very well. Now I've got this, fantastic noise canceling speaker or microphone in here, and the camera, which we had problems with today because it was kind of wonky. But, it's heads and tails above what it was when I first started doing this. And so those are huge differences. I'm not sure that there's any big difference, as we've just discussed, between my 14 and your 16, other than you've got is it a camera button? Is that what you said?
Yeah, you just press it and it goes.
Press
right
the
to
button and it automatically brings the camera up. Does that save you a whole lot? I don't know. Maybe if you're really using the camera a lot, that saves some time. You said you've never actually used the camera button.
No, but you can change the camera button. You
Uh-huh.
can change it. So if you don't want it to be the camera, it can be something else. So if you like your notes or et cetera.
Flashlight,
Yeah,
that's what I
flashlight.
Whatever, you can change it to whatever is the most
Yeah.
used app.
But it's also on the 15. Because I have the 15, so the camera button's also on the 15 and does the same thing as the 16.
Okay. All right, so is there a big difference between the 15 and the 16?
No.
I don't know. I mean, we could go down the list of features, and I'm gonna bet that most of them don't really make that much of a difference at this point. So is there a significant point of difference between the product or service? If there's not, that's one of the reasons that you may have a failure. And at some point, people may get tired of having to buy the latest, and they're just not gonna switch. Now, one way that they can deal with that, so for example, Garmin does this. It's Garmin products in airplanes are to have a certified product in an airplane requires that the FAA be able to walk on to your floor. And it's one of the reasons why they're still manufactured in the United States. Who's the largest consumer of aviation products? The US. Why? Because we travel more by air than any other country. It's really cheap in this country. We have a lot of people who do it. We have a large middle class that can afford to travel by air. We don't have great other forms of transportation. If you want to take, for example, in Europe, you can get on a high-speed train and you can go all over Europe. And in many respects, it's going to be a much more pleasant experience than getting on an airplane in Europe, right? Particularly for because Europe is small, right, compared to the United States. So we fly a lot in the United States. That means the largest consumer of large airplanes are American airline companies, right? If you want to sell that, you have to go through the FAA. The FAA has to be able to walk onto your floor for anything that you put in that airplane, in a certified airplane. The FAA has to be able to walk onto your floor and inspect at any time, day or night, 24 hours a day. That means that it's manufactured in the United States. What does that mean? The labor costs are really, really high. So things like the navigation system in your car, which are far more sophisticated than a lot of the navigation systems that we have in airplanes now, that can all be manufactured in China and shipped over. Not so with Garmin. So Garmin has these products, right? They're expensive. To get a new Garmin G1000 suite in your airplane is something like $75,000, right? How are they? They're still manufacturing the 750. What does Garmin do to ensure that you're going to have to upgrade at some point? Well, for example, on the 530, Garmin just stopped supporting it. If you have a 530 and it breaks, that's it. You're out of luck. If the screen breaks, Garmin won't support it. I guess we'll have to stop there because I'm out of time. If you got ducks, come see me.